Stanford University.
The Aurora Forum is presented by Stanford Lively Arts and the Stanford Institute for Creativity in the Arts, and is co-sponsored by the Office of the President and Provost and Stanford's Office of Public Affairs. Welcome to the Aurora Forum at Stanford University. I'm Mark Gonnerman, the Forum's director, and we're very pleased that you've taken time out to join us this evening for a conversation on Charles Mingus, music, and the struggle for civil rights with Professor Claiborne Carson and Sue Mingus, widow of the great artist whose work we will celebrate tonight. I'm going to introduce our two guests, and then we'll plunge into the conversation for a while among the three of us here on stage. And we'll have time for the last half hour or so for you to contribute questions and comments. I think most of you already know Professor Claiborne Carson, who was a participant and observer of African American political movements during his undergraduate years at UCLA. Since receiving his doctorate at UCLA in 1975, he has taught at Stanford, where he is director of the Martin Luther King Jr. Research and Education Institute. Under his direction, the King Papers Project has produced six volumes of a projected 14-volume comprehensive edition of King's speeches. And in addition to these volumes, he has authored numerous other works based on the papers, including the autobiography of Martin Luther King Jr., which was assembled from Dr. King's writings and published in 1998. Dr. Carson is always in demand as a speaker nationally and internationally, and I'm sure he'll be on the road during Black History Month, which begins today. So we're very pleased, Clay, that you can join us here tonight. Our guest from New York City is Sue Graham Mingus, who first met Charles Mingus in 1964 while the bassist was playing at the Five Spot in New York City. Born in Milwaukee, educated at Smith College, and with strong ties to the avant-garde art scene, she worked in New York. She was making a film when she met Mingus, and she joined him and helped him set up his own record company. They fell in love, and by 1966 exchanged vows in a ceremony conducted by mutual friend, the poet Allen Ginsberg. Until Mingus's death on January 5th, 1979, from Lou Gehrig's disease, Sue Mingus was deeply involved in promoting his music. Now, more than 3 decades after Mingus has passed, she continues to carry the torch for his musical legacy through groups such as the Mingus Dynasty, which will perform tomorrow night at Dinkelspiel Auditorium, the Mingus Big Band, heard on the CD that you were listening to as you came into the house. They'll be here on April 13th, and the Mingus Orchestra. In 2002, Pantheon of Random House Press released Sue's memoir of her life with Mingus, entitled Tonight at Noon, A Love Story, which was a New York Times notable book and a Los Angeles Times Best Book of the Year. It was released in paperback the following year and has been translated into several languages. Please join me in welcoming our guests to the Aurora Forum stage. I think it would be great to start off listening to you read a bit from your book, and going back to 1964, when you first met Charles Mingus. I very much enjoyed reading your book. It's beautifully crafted and composed. It moves in and out of various scenes of your intimate life with Charles Mingus and his public life. And there's this moment early in the book when you write about him going to the Monterey Jazz Festival. And
I think you marked it, right?
yeah, it's marked right there on page 34. And we have this picture up here Charles Mingus at Monterey in 1964. And it's a point in the book that is a real emotional high. I felt as I was reading it. A lot of things were coming together for Charles Mingus and for the two of you in that year. And I think we'd like to hear what you wrote about that.
Well, I'm not sure it's as emotional as you say, but anyway. In mid-September, Mingus announced that he was heading out to the Monterey Jazz Festival in California. Along with other compositions he'd written, he planned to present an extended work about integration that he called Meditations for a Pair of Wire Cutters. We were sitting at a Madison Avenue deli uptown, and he was bringing me up to date. It's fully orchestrated, he said from across the table, as people around us were ordering from their breakfast menu, and he was ordering a high-protein array of meat and cheeses from the dinner page. Sometimes I call it Meditations on Integration, and sometimes Meditations on Inner Peace. The waitress had left to discuss his burgeoning order with some higher authority. I mean, we'll be performing it with an expanded band. We'll rehearse it for 3 days out there. You know, in Europe, we were only playing with a quintet. I wasn't sure why the expanded band was special, but he was exuberant and his high spirits were growing higher. He explained that the piece he'd written had become a hymn to injustice, that he dedicated it to Black Americans imprisoned behind electric barbed wire in the South. Where are they imprisoned? I asked immediately. He took for granted that his assertions were self-evident. I was constantly catching up. Sometimes I only half believed him. They were facts out of my range. It was hard to separate his excesses from his truths, although frequently they were the same. He said he'd heard about the internments from his saxophonist Eric Dolphy before their final tour together. He said he couldn't get them out of his mind. They don't have ovens and gas faucets in this country yet, he said grimly, as the waitress reappeared with a hunk of gorgonzola and a giant steak. But they have electric fences. So I wrote a prayer about some wire cutters. I wrote a prayer we'd buy some scissors and get out. A week later, moments after the concert was over in Monterey, he called me in New York from a phone backstage. He said the crowd had roared its approval for 5 solid, unbelievable minutes while he paced back and forth across the raised platform of the band shell, his leather sandals flapping against his bare feet while the crowd stood up and screamed. He said he never even looked up. He was too scared. At rehearsal, he told his trumpet player, Lonnie Hillier, that the music was a prayer, and he, Lonnie, was the preacher. I told him it's like when disorganization comes in and you've got to straighten it out, he said. I told him it's like a minister in church or like a Jewish rabbi, everybody shouting at you. You've got to chant and put them back into condition. He was on a roll. I barely had a chance to speak. He said he'd been playing to God and that he felt close to death. Next day, I read about it in the press. And then they quote Charles. I felt pains in my chest, he told a reporter. I felt them once before and it scared me. This time it didn't matter. I said, to hell with it. I'll go on playing what I'm playing even if I die. By the end of the week, Time magazine had ranked him among the greatest composers in jazz. And again, a quote. At the end of his gasser of a concert, raved the reporter, 5,000 cats rose in a thunderous ovation they had not accorded Ellington or Dizzy Gillespie or even Thelonious Monk. Monk had been on the cover of Time magazine a few months before. This was in 1964. Another paper compared his bowing to Pablo Casals and his compositions to Debussy. The New York Herald Tribune wrote that he had erased the memory of any other bass player in jazz. Mingus told someone else he was playing to love and to the spirit. When he came home, he said he was playing to me. I didn't really believe him. I didn't understand the size of his feelings, for me or for anything else. I wasn't ready. His roar and his clatter were like the sound of breaking glass. I wasn't ready at all. So that's pretty much.
I think before we talk about that, it'd be great. We have a video clip of him and the ensemble playing this piece. They were touring in Europe in April. This piece was premiered at Cornell in March of that same year. And so let's just take a look so we have an idea of what's going on, then we'll talk about it. Whoa. So one of the things...
Yeah, we still play the Mingus Big Band. Today is Tuesday. Last night, they played it. We have a band that plays every Monday night in New York. We have 3 different bands, actually. Is this... I feel like a Martian with this. But anyway, we still we're carrying on this wonderful music. Am I screaming?
No, let's just move it down here a little bit.
Okay.
Whoops. Okay, and then it should be down a little bit further.
Don't pull out my eye, okay.
Okay.
Okay, where were we?
Oh, now the mic is up by your eye.
Oh, this is supposed I see.
There you go.
Mm.
Okay, that'll be good.
All right.
So just last night.
Pardon?
So just last night.
Oh, no, the band was playing Meditations in New York at a club, the Mingus Big Band, which will be out here on April 13th.
That's right. So what really struck me about that passage is how Mingus was recognized then as a composer. And I read somewhere that he has left us the second largest legacy of compositions in the history of American music. The first being Duke Ellington, I suppose.
Well, that's really the biggest change in perception of Charles from the time he died 32 years ago, is when Mingus was alive, because he was such a huge personality on stage, and he was a virtuoso bass player, and he was a band leader, an outsized band leader. People did not think of him essentially as a composer. People weren't playing his music the way they played Duke. So this is really what has happened since Charles died, is this understanding that he left an enormous legacy of 20th century American composition, second only to Duke Ellington. And Charles always said he was first and foremost a composer. And I took my cue from Charles. But people didn't really play his music when he was alive. I don't think they wanted to trespass the territory. You know, he kind of dominated his own music and other people weren't playing it. But he left over 300 works of composition. And
is that part of your work now, cataloging, publishing?
well, that's right. When Charles died, there was a tribute at Carnegie Hall with a number of different bands playing, and they asked me to put together a band to play Mingus music, something I had never done, never talked to Charles about doing anything like this. And so I put together a band with the makeup of the one that had been on these historical Columbia record albums from 1959, Mingus Mingus Dynasty. And it was a 7-piece band, and it had so much spirit that we just kept it going after that. And the interesting thing at this particular concert was that nobody played Mingus music. Our little band was the only one that played Mingus music, and that's when the realization came that there was a reason for having a band that carried it on. People thought I was crazy in the beginning, particularly in Europe. They said, how can you have a Mingus band without Mingus there? And as I said, I took my cue from Charles, who knew, as composers know, that their music will live on.
I want to get back to that, but I want to bring Clay into the conversation because the last time Mingus performed Meditations on Integration was at UCLA in 1965 when you were there for your first year.
Just arrived.
And did you hear Mingus? Did you know about him?
I was just trying to think of, I thought I first heard him in a club, so that would have been Shelley's Manhole, probably, not in a concert kind of setting. But, you know, it's hard after all these years to remember exactly when. But
were you Mingus aware as a student?
Probably not, no. I mean, I think just a little bit of context in terms of my own background. I arrived in LA late in '64 and arrived in Los Angeles late in '64 and enrolled in UCLA in 1965. And coming from a small town, kind of getting immersed in the cultural and life of Los Angeles. I never lived on campus. I lived in West Hollywood, and really, for me, it was the most exciting period of my life, coming into this new environment, which was in itself, LA was changing so rapidly during this time. And I just noticed in your memoir, at the same time, you're spawning these underground newspapers. I was writing for the Los Angeles Free Press, and that provided me access to a lot of the aspects of Los Angeles scene. And in fact, it allowed me as a poor student to get into a lot of things that I could get a pass, a press pass to get into things that normally I couldn't afford. So it was
equivalent,
for me also, I think, and you've kind of hinted at this, that Charles Mingus, apart from the music, which, quite frankly, I don't think I would have fully understood its significance at that time, but the way in which he expressed the political tone of the time, the mid-1960s, when many people, I think in some ways that's expressed by James Baldwin in that The Fire Next Time, the way in which the movement for integration was coming to the point where people were saying, are we sure we want to be integrated into that? And there were people who were expressing those kinds of doubts and really challenging in a way that the mainstream civil rights leaders were not challenging the kind of the tone of integration and beginning to put forward something more militant. And
something more what?
Something more militant, something more abrasive even. I mean, one of the things that happened right at that time when I came was Leroy Jones. Baraka came to LA with his play The Dutchman, and in a sense that signaled in the world of drama the same thing that was happening with Coltrane and obviously Charlie Mingus, in terms of beginning to comment about what was going on in the political scene. Now, I think he had always done that. One of the things.
Well, he used his bandstand like a soapbox.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that maybe
delivered his views about everything. It was part of the performance, really.
Yeah.
It was sharing with the audience his feelings about everything that was going on in the music industry, racially, socially, whatever problems there were. He talked about them always from the stage, and off the stage, wherever he was.
You were mentioning how people didn't play his music as much while he was alive, and I just wondered whether you could comment. Maybe that was because it was very difficult to play his music to his satisfaction at the time?
Well, I think partly because he was a large figure and he dominated his music, and maybe people thought, there wasn't who knows? Charles's music at the time was considered difficult, inaccessible, the way any original sound is. Our ears grow up with time. We just started a Mingus High School competition 2 years ago. We're in our third year in 2 weeks from now. It will take place in New York with kids coming from all over the country, and you should hear them play Mingus music. It's not inaccessible at all. It's just that 30 years later, something that appeared to be inaccessible, and maybe when Charles was there, I know that was the general feeling, that it was hard music, it was difficult music.
But in your book, you have these anecdotes of people.
Pardon?
In the book, you have some anecdotes of performances where he's not satisfied with the piano player, and right in the middle or at the end of a set, tell him to leave the stage and things like that.
Oh, no, he fired people all through.
Maybe that would intimidate
I tell the
people.
musicians now, if Charles were here, he'd fire all of them. But, because he fired everyone all the time. His drummer would get fired 2 or 3 times a night, often.
He was incredibly demanding, wasn't he?
He was very demanding, and he did everything to get the kind of music that he wanted. He insulted you, loved you, whatever. He had that enormous energy, and he cared so deeply about the music. So, there wasn't a resentfulness in that sense, that people understood all of this passion and rage and love came out of his involvement and this deep caring that he had for the music. He wanted it played right. He wanted it played the way he wanted it played. And he did everything to make that happen. Well, and not everybody liked it. That wasn't everybody's cup of tea. John Handy, who lives out here in San Francisco. I know at times it was a bit much. This is an interesting thing that's going on here. Can you hear me out there?
Should I try to put it on again?
No, that's okay.
Okay. I want to go back to what you said about, here you can have a hand mic. Is that easier?
Oh, that would be much better.
Okay, great. Thank you, Nick. That passage you read, there's an allusion to the band leader as a preacher, or the composer as someone who tries to put things in focus, bring things back into order. And I think there's an interesting thing throughout the music of a dialectic of chaos and order. And you said when he's on stage and he's talking about his opinions, that's part of the performance. And then you said an off stage too, and I get this sense when I read your memoir and I read other things about Mingus that he was really the same person on stage and in the street. That he was always authentically who he was. And could you see, being so close to him though, when he's on stage, was he a different person on stage, or was it the same person that you knew?
Charles was always the same person. He was one of the most honest people I've ever met in my life, and he expressed his truth at all times, on the bandstand and off. Life was more difficult, you know, in society for Charles at the time. He was very peaceful. People always asked, because Charles was called jazz's angry man when I met him in 1964. At home, he spent his time at the piano composing. He always took credit for his virtuosity on the bass because he worked, so the story went, 7 hours. This is your weakest finger because there's no muscle of its own. And he worked whatever it was, an impossible number of hours a day to make it his fastest finger. But he always said the melody came from God. And he said he would go to the piano and the music was waiting for him on the keys.
Nice.
But he spent hours and hours at the piano composing and playing, and Charles was a very gentle person, but he was also a person who believed strongly in what he believed, and he encountered a lot of obstacles in the real world. His skin was the wrong color, his passions were outsized, and life was not always easy. He wasn't always just. He made a lot of ridiculous scenes, and he made a lot of scenes that mattered and that maybe were ahead of his time. He always said he couldn't go south because he knew he would get himself killed, because he spoke out about anything that he believed was unjust and unfair. And that was one of the great things, you know, one of the things that caused difficulties for Charles in his life, because he was always speaking out. And, you know, there are not always occasions where we're supposed to speak out about everything. But yes, he was a genuine voice wherever he was, on the street or on the bandstand or whatever.
One of the obstacles that the two of you confronted together was the way the music industry works and the production of records and publishing. So you decided to take matters into your own hands. So that's another thing that's happening here as he comes out of Monterey, and you decide to produce this record from the Monterey Jazz Festival yourself.
He had done that before. Charles, I think, started possibly the first black-owned record company back in the days of Debut Records, which was in the, whenever it was, late 40s, early 50s. He and Celia, his wife Celia, started Debut Records, and this was a second time around that after Monterey, he decided to start his own record company again, because he felt he wasn't getting the right numbers from the right record companies, that they were favoring white artists over black artists, and for a whole lot of reasons. He started his own Charles Mingus music, whatever it was called, Charles Mingus Records, I think. And we released 4 albums, one of which was this Mingus at Monterey. That was the first.
It seems like that project, the two of you were kind of testing each other, checking each other out. And I got the feeling in reading your memoir that almost reluctantly, you got more and more involved in the work, and then you brought your own voice into it more and more, and the partnership really evolved through a series of struggles about what it would mean to produce something like that together. What was your hesitation about getting into this?
Well, it wasn't so much about the record company, it was just about our relationship. I mean, we fought for about 8 years, essentially because I did not want to get married. I didn't want to live in relationship. Charles, what he used to say is he wanted love with an address. And I didn't want love with an address. I wasn't ready. But after 8 years, it only took 8 years, and then he moved in. The minute he moved in, we never fought again. It was only about that. That was really the core of our friction.
But he did move right across the street from you at one point.
Well, that was early on. The first or second year, he found an apartment right across the street from me, and he set up this light show so that I couldn't escape. And And light shows were starting in New York at the time. People had these light machines. I remember the Village Vanguard had a light machine. And Charles created these masterpieces of lights. They were obscene, they were religious, they were sacred, and they were exploding day and night. And he got letters in his mailbox saying, "Dear Mr. Lightman, your show is fabulous, you know, or magician, you're a groove." All these letters, because everyone on the block noticed them. And they were reflected off my walls. I mean, there was no escaping Charles.
Did you think they were fabulous?
I did not think they were fabulous. I thought they were a big royal pain in the neck.
But
And he would sit outside the street in his convertible with his music playing. I mean, he...
So you were being courted. He was a troubadour
courted.
beneath your window with lights. But
He was always coming up with ideas. He found something called a marriage museum. I was working at this New York Free Press, which I was co-publishing at the time. And around the corner, down the block, there was something called a marriage museum. So Charles, just to be a bother from my point of view, decided he was going to have a wedding at the marriage museum. And there were going to be different women. It was going to be sort of a lottery. I mean, he sent these messages up to the Free Press where I worked, inviting them all to his wedding at the marriage museum. And there were going to be 3 or 4 candidates, and it would be determined at the last minute, you know, who the wife was actually going to be. And of course, he never did it. But these were these assaults.
One of the things this kind of gets at is the way in which he stayed on the cutting edge of, you know, there's an aspect of jazz that wanted to stay. I mean, there's still people who play Dixieland, you know, and not wanting to change or not wanting to move. And here is Charles Mingus, who is really on the cutting edge from the big band era through bebop, through all the way to Joni Mitchell in the 70s, and just changing, and the psychedelic scene, and that I think you get into also, just always being creative in a way that reflects the times, and that's in a way
and incorporating the history at the same time. I mean,
right.
He used Dixieland. He included Dixieland and every kind of music.
Yeah, it's you know, there's probably no other person who can bridge the eras from even back to Louis Armstrong but Lionel Hampton and the big bands and just everything in between. And that's maybe one of the reasons why his composing is such a valuable resource. I mean, you were part of that. You know,
and then he left a lot of openness in his music, which is what attracts the musicians so much, because it's very demanding music. It demands you to come in and play yourself and be yourself. Charles always used to yell, "Be yourself, be yourself, play yourself." And so musicians come in and they bring in their own identity, their own voices, which keeps the music modern and up to date and fresh.
And didn't he write specifically for the people he thought would be playing?
Many times he wrote like Duke did, with specific musicians in mind, like Eric Dolphy or Jack Walrath and George Adams at a later time. Depending, you know, there was a time when Charles dispensed with what he called pencil composers, and but there were musicians who weren't good readers, so he would write a different way. When Jack Walrath and George Adams came into the band, who were really good writers, he wrote out more extended compositions. So in that sense, he reflected the guys who were playing in his band also.
Well, your comment reminds me of a line in your book, Sue, which goes something like, there was this tension in Mingus between kind of Puritanism, a regard for boundaries and rules. At the same time, there was this incredible openness to experience, right? So the respect for the musical and other traditions, and yet always moving out into new territory. And this is a really creative tension in his life and work, right? It seems to me that point in your book, that's a fundamental point you're making about him.
Absolutely.
which created a lot of energy. And I think he seems to be tossed and turned by this kind of movement between being, well, you have this quest for freedom, say, with
Well,
this.
it's the respect for the past and for everything that went before you, which I remember Charles saying without any sort of arrogance at all. He was saying, how could I not be better than Bach or Beethoven? Or he said, because they laid it all out for me, was the way he put it. That if you're a serious musician, you take everything that came before you and you incorporate that into your music, and then you go on from there with your own voice.
So you said he would immerse himself at the piano in the activity of composing. Did he study a lot?
Well, all that was behind him, I think, all the studying.
Uh-huh.
And
yet you say when you're going through his studio and you find his Bible, that the margins are full of annotations. Did he spend time sitting with books and looking at the past and looking at texts?
Well, Charles was always expressing himself, whether it was in the margin of books or yelling on the street. I mean, the expression was there. But as far as learning or studying, there's a time in your life when you're studying, and then you go on and most of the musicians I know listen to them. So at Sonny Rollins' house, you hear Sonny Rollins. At Mingus's house, you hear Mingus. He was not listening when I knew him to others anymore because he'd done that before. I mean, maybe he would listen to Beethoven and Bach, but generally, he wasn't. He most of the time he was composing. He was not listening to other people's music. That was part of his training and his growing up.
And did composing keep him sane?
Pardon?
Did composing keep him sane?
I suppose you could say that. It was a world he could count on. It was his own world. It was the center of his being, his composition. And he would go to the piano and find his peace, certainly.
Mark, I just wonder whether before going too much further, it would be good to find out who you are.
Pardon?
Who you are, in the sense of, one of the questions that I asked myself before reading the memoir was, who was this person who was going to have a long-term relationship with a person who might have been somewhat difficult in many respects? And so part of the surprise of the book is that it's not like you came from a jazz background or you were familiar with that scene before you got...
It is odd,
Yes,
admittedly.
you might say a few words just about what when 1964, what you came from into the relationship with Charles Mingus. Because it seems a little bit of an improbable when you look at the backgrounds.
It was highly improbable. I came from it had nothing to do with music. Charles was a man of great energy and imagination and courage, and he was a fascinating individual. Was he easy in a normal, standard way? No. But, I came from a musical family that had nothing to do with jazz, but can you hear me? I suddenly can hear myself all of a sudden. My mother was a harpist and a piano player, and my father loved opera and sang opera all the time. And I studied music from the time I was 6 until I went to college. But jazz, I didn't know anything about jazz when I met Charles. And I was in a movie of Robert Frank's, and Robert wanted a jazz soundtrack, which is how I happened to go out for the first time in my life to a jazz club. I went to hear Dizzy Gillespie, and then I went to hear Mingus. And I didn't really know who anybody was. But that was my introduction. And I got to know jazz through Charles.
And you had come from a very privileged background also.
Pardon?
A very privileged background? But that would be a good way to describe it?
I guess you could say that.
Yeah. And
It was certainly very different from Charles's background. It was a safe, Middle West background.
What did you study at Smith?
History and English.
Which is where you became a fine writer.
No, it was worlds in collision in the beginning, but we were very similar in many ways. I mean, it probably sounds odd, but
That's one of the
Charles
points
felt like family from the first time I saw him. Who can explain that? There was something very familiar about him, and he was a very moral, pure, he was very much like my father in many ways. I think that was a connection I felt.
Yeah, I think you described them both as very strong-willed kind of individuals, and
angry,
yeah.
pure.
How were you discovered as an actress by Robert Frank? How did you?
Well, an actress I really wasn't, but at the time I used to photograph well, and I did a screen test and it came out well. So I was in a movie of Robert's. They played at the first film festival here in New York.
Huh.
And it was in connection with that. Robert wanted Ornette Coleman to do a soundtrack, and I think the money wasn't right for Ornette. That was one of the first questions I asked Mingus when I met him. If I knew, he was my only connection to the jazz world, if he knew Ornette, and he said immediately, "Are you his old lady?" And I had no idea what that meant. I said, "His mother?" and he said, you know, it was just another language entirely.
Yeah.
So you went on and founded a magazine, Change magazine.
Changes, yeah.
Changes. What was that magazine about?
Well, we were all putting out the New York Free Press at the time, and I think the story was that one of the people who owned all the newsstands said to the publisher, Rolling Stone had come out on the West Coast, and it was very popular. And this news person, whoever he was, said to Jack Banning, if I gave you $5,000, how soon could you give me a music magazine? And Jack famously said, next week. That was a bundle of money at the time. So anyway, I flew out to California and I met with different record company executives, and because all the money was paid for with ads from record companies, oddly enough, because we were an underground radical, you know, writing about, well, the 60s, you know, there was a lot of student protests going on, and it was movements festering all over the place. And this was underwritten by the record companies until they suddenly realized that maybe we weren't on their side and they pulled out. But that's how Changes started. It was a music magazine. And it grew and it developed into other things.
So part of your history seems to be taking on large projects and just jumping in and figuring it out as you go.
Very much like jazz. I mean,
very much like jazz.
Very improvised.
A jazz life. So how did you decide to write this memoir?
What I really wanted, I didn't want to write a memoir. I wanted to write about the year that Charles died in Mexico, because it was an astonishing year. Charles, to take a man as physical as Charles was and to wipe him out the way Lou Gehrig's disease does, where you just become a cabbage in a wheelchair. And I learned so much that year from Charles. For a man, the angry man of jazz, who never railed at the gods for his condition and was constantly inventing things to do, mountains to climb, valleys to explore in his wheelchair. We had a special car that accommodated the wheelchair. We had gone to Mexico to hang out with the witches there.
Cuernavaca.
In Cuernavaca, as we were told there was a witch by the name of Pachita that could cure Charles, which didn't happen. But we had a very colorful, energetic, I mean, astonishing year for a man who was dying. It was filled with invention and
it was grueling.
Vitality.
It was grueling.
Well, it was grueling. But I have to say, Charles kept this astonishing vitality going. We were always doing doing something, inventing something, and food. Food was always a great destination for Charles, sick or well.
Well, you're always getting in the little bus you had and going on excursions all over the countryside.
We were, all over Mexico,
the spirit
all
of...
night long. Charles couldn't sleep, ever. He wrote a piece called The Man Who Never Sleeps. And he said we would catch him every now and then sleeping, but he would claim that he dreamt he was awake, so it didn't count. But we would drive all night long, and he would jostle. He was tied to a wheelchair in the back of the van. It was like a cradle that would give him some comfort, you know, driving through the night through the mountains in Mexico and finding food stands, road stands on the side with great excitement.
Always a spirit of adventure.
Always a spirit, just a spirit of life. Charles had this astonishing spirit of life, and that's what was so remarkable about this year of dying in Mexico, that it never lapsed, this appetite for life. Frozen in a wheelchair with his hands tied because they would fall off if they weren't tied on to the... It was amazing. I mean, he was destroyed physically, and that energy and passion. So that's what I wanted to write about. I was going to call it Portrait of the Artist as a Dying Man. But then, as you were saying, who's this voice? The editor said, but who's writing the story? You have to tell us who you are. And which was nothing I was interested in doing, and that was the hardest part, because I'm not a professional writer. Okay, and you never know whether because to be interesting, you have to unearth your truths and your embarrassments and expose yourself, but then you never know if you're going too far and you're just boring and running off at the mouth. And it's a tension that, you know, if you're not a professional, it's very scary. And you don't know really what you're doing. But my editors wanted to bring me into the mix.
I'll have to say, I started reading at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, but for a dinner break, I just kept reading until 1 in the morning. I couldn't put it down. I'm
so glad, because I was wondering, how do you keep things moving? You know, how do you have this forward thrust?
Yeah.
And so I'm glad to hear that.
It's a remarkable...
You might say a few words about the significance of the title, because it fits with what you were saying about the lack of sleep.
Tonight at noon.
Oh, Tonight at Noon. Well, the title actually came from the jazz life, which is topsy-turvy, as Charles used to say. Well, let's back up even before that. Charles wrote a piece called Midnight Sun, and Lionel Hampton stole it, according to Charles. So he came up with a better title, I think, Tonight at Noon, and then he had another title called Noon Night, which is a beautiful ballad. We play both of them in our repertory bands. Tonight at Noon goes faster than the speed of light. It's a very swift piece, and Noon Night is a lush ballad. But anyway, the idea is that, as Charles said, in the good old days, jazz clubs used to close at 4 in the morning, and then you'd go and hang out maybe outside Birdland. He and Miles would talk until 6 or 7, and then they'd head up to Harlem and play in an after-hours club until 10 or 11, and they'd get home at noon, so that their midnight was noon. And hence the title, Tonight at Noon. So when I took Charles's ashes to India to scatter them in the Ganges, which he requested, and he believed in reincarnation. So I was thinking of this also as a kind of reincarnation, his death being tonight and then being reincarnated once again into the sunlight in the noon. So it had a few different meanings.
He was interested, he would say, in all the prophets. That he said that Swami Vivekananda and Ramakrishna really spoke to him. And there is this India connection.
Well, the Hindu religion incorporates all the other religions, and I think Charles liked it because it was tolerant. There was no prejudice. They included all the religions. And he would call out their names in the bandstand, you know, Jesus, Moses, Buddha, all the prophets. And he enjoyed that.
Well, let's open up to questions from members of our audience, and that'll spark additional conversation. We don't have a mic in the house, so just project your voice, and I'll repeat the question for the tape.
Magazine.
It was a magazine that was called Changes. Well, that's, yeah. No, actually, Charles wrote a piece called, he wanted to call it Sue's Moods, because it goes through all sorts of different changes in moods, and because I had the magazine, I said, call it Sue's Changes. So he would all make a point whenever he talked to any reporter that it was not about my newspaper, even though it was called Sue's Changes. But it should have been Sue's Moods. Probably would have been a better title. The band is going to play it tomorrow, actually, if they get here.
Do you identify with it, the piece? Does it capture your moods?
I do, I do.
Yes.
How would Charles describe you?
Well, in this piece, if you hear Sue's Changes, it goes through their lyrical moments. There's an absolutely chaotic, insane section with everybody playing at once. And it goes through a lot of different kinds of moods, and I think that was his idea of a biography, a portrait.
How would Charles describe the human condition?
I don't know. I mean, he would describe it differently probably every time you talk to him. It was always interesting because Charles it would be the same event, but he would describe it 10 different ways depending on what was in his mind at the time or what he remembered at that moment. His mind was so fertile, his imagination was so fertile that he was always reinterpreting things.
And that sometimes verged on paranoia.
Sometimes absolutely based on paranoia. The distinction between reality and imagination was often very difficult for Charles himself to distinguish.
He didn't do drugs.
Because he was getting so much feedback. His imagination was so towering. And it spilled over into real life. And I think it was often hard for Charles himself to know where one started and the other picked up.
You had a relationship with Timothy Leary, and it's interesting because Charles was just tripping on his own imagination.
Indeed, yeah, we would go up to Millbrook and never dropped acid. Charles never dropped acid, and I never did.
Maybe for him it would have been redundant.
Yeah, I mean, he didn't need acid. Yeah. I mean, I should say, I don't know if you can see that I have the bandages on my forehead. I just in connection with this last week, by mistake, I was going to Europe and I had pills out and I thought I was taking a pain pill and it was an Ambien. I don't know if any of you have ever taken Ambien. It's a sleeping pill. And every now and then I'll take a third of an Ambien. But I took a whole Ambien. And I didn't really, if I take a piece of an Ambien, I go to bed and I go to sleep. So I've never really known the effect it has. But I was in the office. I was supposed to go to a fancy party at the mayor's mansion for Grammy. We were nominated for a Grammy for our latest Mingus Big Band album. And I was all dressed and ready to go. And I took this Ambien. And all of it was amazing. I had no idea I was hallucinating. The furniture was talking to me. I look at my chairs and tables differently now. I mean, they were so supportive and so wonderful, and they were all talking to me, and we were having just a wonderful time, and my desk was merging with other furniture, and it was all woody and warm and like library, and I talked to the friend that I was supposed to pick up, and she sensed something was a little odd. So she sent a car to get me. And I got up, and I walked into a door. They always say, and It didn't, it surprised me a little bit, but it fit in with everything else.
You were trying to walk through the door.
And there was blood all over the place, and I was wiping it up. And the next day, people told me they'd seen me in the hall clutching my forehead with Kleenex. But anyway, I took this card that was sent, and my friend immediately took me to the hospital, and they sewed 6 stitches. And so this was my trip that I never had at Tim Leary's. This is the reason I'm telling you this. It was an amazing experience.
It was
Hallucinating like that without even knowing that and it seemed completely normal. And the room was full of people. That was the other thing. I told my friend, I said, there are all kinds of, I actually voiced it, so it stepped beyond my hallucination. I was telling someone else about all the people. I don't think I told her about the furniture.
Do you want to try that again?
No, I was afraid today. I mean, it was kind of harrowing afterwards because I was dizzy. And
since we're on the subject of your visits to Timothy Leary's place, could you tell us about the wedding in Allen Ginsberg?
That wasn't at Tim's. I mean, that was, oh yeah, where was that? No, that was in Peggy Hitchcock's apartment. We had gone to Peggy Hitchcock, it was actually the Hitchcock estate where Tim Leary was conducting his experiments with a couple of other professors from Harvard. And Peggy had a townhouse in Manhattan, and I think we'd all gone there to celebrate somebody's wedding the next day. It was kind of a prenuptial party. And Peggy lived in a brownstone with 5 floors. There was an elevator. And so Charles wanted to explore, typically. And we ended up on the 4th floor where there was a library, and there typically was Allen Ginsberg, who had also decided to explore. I would never have thought to explore somebody's private home and gone and snooped all over the place. But this was typical of Mingus and Allen. So we saw Allen, and Charles, out of the blue, said, "Marry us." So Allen, who always, dear Allen, whatever came up, he was ready for. So he pulled up 2 spindly chairs, and we sat down. And at the time, he used to carry these little cymbals. And so he chanted for an hour. Rame, Rame, Krishna, 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 Rame, whatever, for an hour. And then he stopped. And Charles looked at him. He said, "You married me," because Allen was focusing on Charles, I think. And Charles said, "You married me, now marry her." So he did it. He went again for a whole other hour of Rame Krishna, Rame Krishna. And when we sort of came to after these 2 hours, we were surrounded by all the people who had come for this other prenuptial occasion. And they had wrapped up presents from things around the house. And they uncorked a couple bottles of champagne.
Another improvisation.
Another improvisation, yeah.
Other questions? Yes. Yes.
I have a couple of questions. One is, did you have nicknames for each other? And if so, what were they?
Thank you.
Did you have nicknames for each other? And if so, what were they?
I don't remember nicknames.
Okay. And did you live the midnight at noon life also? Did you go to all of Charles's?
Did I what?
Did you live the noon at midnight life as well? Did you live the life with the jazz schedule and the clubs and?
No, not really. I had kids. I had 2 kids that were growing up. Now, I mean, I have since Charles died, and with these repertory bands and so forth. And now the jazz life is pathetic. I mean, we end, our last set ends at 10:30. I'm ashamed today.
Now, why is that?
I don't know. Charles saw the handwriting on the wall. I remember one night because the last set would end at 4, and there were 4 sets. And I remember Max Gordon, who owned the Village Vanguard, which was a landmark jazz club in New York, telling Charles he was cutting out the 4th set, And instead of being glad that there was less, that he had to play less, Charles looked at him, he said, "You're killing jazz, man." And he saw, he saw that things were shriveling, and
So-
now there are 2 sets, except on weekends, when it actually goes to 11:30, good heavens, or wait a minute.
So that was
9:30.
killing jazz, and was rock killing jazz?
Well, that, you know, actually, when the Beatles came in, that had a big impact on jazz.
Because of what was on the radio, because of the way rock was marketed?
Just the
I mean,
shift,
what-
no, the shift in interest, the crowds, you know, there's cycles, and rock came in and jazz slowly petered out. I mean, not completely, but not, you know, jazz was in its heyday in 1964. Charles and Monk could play for 6 months at a time at the 5 spot. When I met Charles, he was playing there. He'd been there for 6 months, and Monk had been there for 6 months before that. Now you're lucky if you play a week somewhere in a club. There was a big difference.
Yeah. Was there another question up there?
Right at the front.
Right there, go ahead.
Given your own history as a writer and an activist and with a free press, is most of your life now oriented toward helping the bands have a good life and toward getting Charles's music out?
I'm working on another book. I just had the same book doctor, as she calls herself, that looked at this, look at about 150 pages last week. And, you know, we have a band that plays every week in New York, and we tour. And,
What's the new book about?
and we publish. I don't want to jinx it by talking about it
Okay.
yet. We publish music, and then for example, the high school competition is taking place in a couple of weeks. There are myriad activities that.
Do you ever lend your voice to any progressive activist causes?
You're talking politically? What am I doing politically now? Beyond speaking, you know, on the bandstand about issues that happen, I mean, what am I doing now? Nothing, probably. In what sense? What are you doing, for example? No, just to get it in context.
Well, trying to get money out of elections, private special interest money out of elections.
Well, you published a Mingus CD, Blues and Politics,
Yeah.
where you pulled together some political speeches and music. Isn't your publishing political?
To think. I mean, when we had the New York Free Press, well, we were out marching for birth control and civil rights and so forth. It's true. And I'm not out marching now for things. We grow old. But I mean,
Along the lines of the way you jump
I
into...
mean, I don't know, what would you suggest?
Exactly what you said, that when you're on the bandstand.
Yeah. No, whether it's whatever awful thing is going on. I mean, you know, it was when we were talking about Martin Luther King, and you wonder how much progress there's been when someone like Congresswoman Gifford and all her associates can be gunned down, you know.
Or the positive things like the liberation movement in Egypt right now.
Yeah, who knows where that's going to go.
I've heard Professor Carson say that really the great story of the 20th century is the story of freedom movements around the world with people liberating themselves. And Clay, it looks like we have another instance of what you often talk about.
Yeah, I mean, and one of the things about it is that you have the completion of these revolutions that were taking place because in Egypt they gained their national independence, but they realize now that wasn't enough, and the revolutions have to be taken to another stage, and that's where we are.
Yeah.
You know, it goes on, and also the cultural part of it goes on. I mean, I think that it's still reflected in popular culture, the mass communications, and all of these aspects are interrelated with people trying to find ways of freeing themselves. I'm sure that there's a Charles Mingus in Cairo. And
No, there are a lot of voices out there that question, you know, we'll see what they're able to do.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Pardon?
Did you help with the selection of the musicians for Mingus Dynasty and Mingus Big Band?
Oh, yeah. No, I choose the musicians. And I try to find a balance each week. Victor Lewis, a drummer, once said that playing Mingus was like a 3-ring circus. And I said, you should have said 4, because you have to read like a classical musician. You have to be able to improvise like a jazz musician. You have to play in the ensemble together. And you have to have a personality or a voice. And it's very demanding. Not everybody has all these things. Some people are better readers. Other people don't read so well, but they're great improvisers. So I try to find a balance with the musicians. And then we were lucky enough to be able to have brand new kids come in. I can't believe it was only last night, when the Mingus Big Band was playing, Seamus Blake, who's supposed to be playing here tomorrow night. We have a problem right now because there's an ice storm in New York, and we've been on the phone all day trying to figure out when the plane is arriving tomorrow. But Seamus couldn't play last night in the big band because he had a recording. So somebody came in who'd never been in the band before by the name of Chris Cheek. He was amazing. He was incredible. So we have this new fresh blood coming in all the time. You know, when a new musician comes into town, I mean, it's like you hear about it like a brush fire. Word travels through the jazz community. And then we have the regulars who know the music. And there's always that risky edge because Mingus music is not, it's not inaccessible the way it used to be considered, but it's not easy. It's complex, wonderfully complex music. And so it doesn't always work if you have new kids there that that can't grasp it right away. It's an adventure. We don't always know what's going to happen. I have to say, last night there was the most extraordinary piece called Little Royal Suite that Charles wrote for Ernie Royal. And it's an extended work. It's so complicated. And the band had not played it in a year, and only these guys. This is the wonderfully lucky thing about Mingus music, that we have these musicians that can interpret it so incredibly and with such spirit, and with music as full of obstacles as it can be. This is a work that changes tempos, changes harmonies, the backgrounds are different in every section, and then there's this soaring horn that comes through that was played by Alex Sabiagan, who also will be here tomorrow. But I thought how they could play this piece without any rehearsal at all. I mean, you have to have 14 geniuses up there to do that. So I know I've wandered astray. I don't know what led to this.
But you're very involved with choosing the musicians.
But I choose the musicians, and sometimes choose, well, we get together and decide, for example, when we go on the road, what we're going to play. What I try to do above all is show this great range of music that Charles wrote, because he wrote extended European classical pieces. He wrote Latin music, he wrote political pieces, he wrote the blues, he wrote lush ballads. And what I try to do whenever we do, it's freer at home when at the club. I'm not as demanding, but when we're on the road, the idea is just to show this enormous spectrum of music that Charles wrote that covers so much ground.
Could you talk a little bit about Epitaph, which was performed, you had arranged a performance in 1989.
Well, Epitaph was Charles's effort to tell the world who he was musically. It was like a long autobiography, and he tried to get it performed in the early 60s, and it was a disaster because the record company moved up the date and so forth. And he thought he was going to show the world who he was musically then with this enormous, the score is 500 pages. It weighed 15 pounds on my bathroom scale. I mean, it was enormous, and it took almost 3 hours we finally performed it posthumously, 10 years after Charles died. It took a year to just make the parts for the score. It was written for 31 musicians. Gunther Schuller conducted it. We performed it a couple of years ago, again at the Disney Center in LA. I think we performed it here maybe 10 years ago in San Francisco. What was the what?
The performance time, how long is the performance?
Well, close to 3 hours. Gunther Schuller called it the Gotterdammerung of jazz. It would even be probably 4.5 hours. We've discovered more pieces that should have been a part of it. Black Saint and Sinner Lady, for example, which was on the same yellow score paper. It was kind of a detective story. A musicologist came to my place not long after Charles died and discovered a trunk full of music just willy-nilly thrown into this trunk. So he asked if he could come back and organize it as a project. And he and his wife, for about a year, took a train from Montreal and came back and forth and organized all this music, in the course of which he discovered Epitaph. He kept finding pieces that began measure number 2,305, called Peggy's Blue Skylight, and then he'd find another piece called Noon Night with measure 4,000 and something. And he pieced it together by measure numbers and found this missing epitaph. But since then, we've discovered still more pieces that have not been performed.
So are there musicologists working now on?
Not any longer, but as I say, we have sections that if we ever perform it again, the last time we performed it, we added 2 more pieces to it.
Where are the manuscripts archived?
The Library of Congress.
So they're available to anyone?
Yeah.
And are there dissertations being written on Mingus now?
Yeah, people have written books and dissertations.
Yeah.
More and more. And there are courses at Mingus that are being taught around the country. And as I say, with this high school competition, it's encouraged music directors also to have their kids learn Mingus.
Yes. Did you two talk about did he talk about what he thought his legacy would be, and how do you think he would feel about what his legacy is at this point?
I mean, I don't think he'd be surprised at all. I mean, I think he once said when he was dying that he would be reincarnated. He said, I'll probably be reincarnated as some unknown cello player playing Bach, Beethoven, and Mingus. So he wouldn't be surprised. But we never talked. We never talked about my carrying on the music or anything, ever. I mean, we were trying to beat the rap, you know, when we were in Mexico. We were.
That's a really interesting comment, given that he started off as a cello player, and then a friend said, look, as a black man, you're not going to make it as a cello player in America. You better learn the bass. And that's quite an optimistic statement, that he's foreseen that he could come back and make it as a cello player playing Bach and Beethoven. So,
and Mingus.
And Mingus, right? But that he could make it in that scene, that things would improve to that degree. So he was optimistic about it.
He was.
He was. Nice. Yeah.
When he was performing, you said he would get some of his political ideas across. I was just wondering, was that through his music, or was that with commentary?
No, no, no. I mean, Charles just expressed himself at all times. And if there was something on his mind or something was happening politically or racially or something was going on in the streets or whatever, he would talk about it. It didn't spill over into his, I mean, it had nothing to do with his music. Charles did not put his music at the service of his political ideas. I mean, he was too much of a composer for that. He wrote some political pieces with narrations, which we'll be doing tomorrow. Oh Lord, don't let them drop that atomic bomb on me, or Fables of Faubus, or Freedom. You know, he wrote political pieces, but his compositions, I mean, his political views had nothing to do, on the whole, with his compositions. But he would talk about everything that he, on the bandstand.
But he would
But
also,
I don't want to confuse the two. I mean, he, you know, he wasn't putting his music at the service of any of his ideas.
and wouldn't he also talk to the audience about their
I mean,
role?
for example, Tim Leary wanted him to do something musically with him at a time when Tim was very fashionable and popular, and Charles turned him down. Allen Ginsberg wanted him to do something, and Charles turned him down. And the Black Panthers, you know, and his music wasn't for sale.
And would he also talk to the audience about their role as an audience? They'd be there at a club, and he would,
No, he just wanted them to listen.
and just to listen.
To listen.
So
No, one time there were people at a table in front of the bandstand talking. So he said, okay, you talk for 4 measures and we'll shut up. And then we'll play for 4 measures and you shut up, you know.
So he had a sense of the jazz club as a concert hall.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, he felt his music deserved to be played in concert halls rather than in noisy jazz clubs. But he expected people to listen.
Did
And
he?
he let that be known. No, he didn't want cash registers ringing when people were playing solos, you know.
So it looked on the Europe tour in '64 that he was in concert halls. And would he be in concert halls in Europe, but not in concert halls in the United States?
I think both. It's just, you know, there weren't that many, I mean, it was a question of money. Also, it's more expensive to perform in a big concert hall. I don't remember back then how often jazz was played in concert halls. Compared to, it was probably mostly played in clubs in the early days.
Yes. Sir.
Actually, I know he is a very composer who is keen to perfectionism, and if he has his whole work and he composes music. But jazz is music which allows some part for solo player to improvise. So, to what degree did Charles Mingus allow each player to improvise during the performances?
What was he saying?
So,
You're saying how much did he want to control the music, considering it? Well, he wanted his musicians to play in the spirit of what he wrote. He certainly he didn't want them. I mean, he was a composer, and he wanted his compositions performed. But as I say, within the context of those compositions, there's an enormous amount of space and freedom for musicians to come. When musicians solo, that's when they can do whatever they want to. And ideally, they will play within the context of the piece. I mean, I've heard soloists, you have, on occasion, I will walk in and I will have no idea what piece they're playing because they've gone so far afield. But a good soloist is going to play within the context of the music and find his own way of bringing his own expression to that. But yeah, Charles was all for play yourself, man.
What musicians share the same spirit with Mingus?
What musicians? Oh, John Hicks certainly did, who was in the band, a piano player. I mean, there are a lot of musicians. Craig Handy is a wonderful Mingus musician. Frank Lacey brings all this freedom and excitement and energy, and so many of the musicians. The kind of musician that likes to play Mingus music to start off has a certain, it attracts a certain kind of musician. He has to be a serious musician. He has to be I've gotten so spoiled, I just expect everyone to be an absolute virtuoso, and they are. They're all just in a total control of their instrument. That's just a given. That's the first level. Then the next level is bringing your own voice and your own interpretation and your own passion, which enhances the music. And that's what I was saying about last night. It was so remarkable to hear this difficult piece played with such vitality and I mean, words fail me. It was perfection. I mean, and with all the mistakes spilling in. I mean, that's the one thing about jazz is you make room. The mistake leads to something even more interesting.
Mm-hmm. So we have a concert tomorrow night. You've been busy all day because of this ice storm, figuring out how this is all going to work. Where do things stand right now?
Right now, I know that we're going to have two musicians of this. We have a marvelous piano player, Kenny Drew Jr., who's coming here from Florida, where fortunately there's no snow, so there's no problem with Kenny getting here. Craig Handy is already out here in San Francisco visiting his parents. And the other five, we're already tapping musicians here in San Francisco. They're great musicians. John Handy, for example, who played with Mingus and has played with the Mingus dynasty. He's here in San Francisco, just because we don't know yet what's happening. In the tradition of Mingus and jazz, everything is uncertain, full of surprise.
And it is happening tomorrow night, and friends of the Aurora Forum can go for 50% off. The code for that is Mingus AF for Aurora Forum. You can say that at the door. You're going to be there, and you speak from the stage during Mingus Dynasty performances?
Sometimes, sometimes not. I mean, it depends.
Are you going to talk to the audience about listening, being an audience?
Well, if our bass player, if Boris Kozlov is here, I probably won't, because Boris knows more about the music than I do, I think, at this point. It depends.
Well,
it depends.
I hope we'll hear more from you.
Okay.
And thank you very much, Professor Claiborne Carson and Sue Mingus, for being with us tonight. I hope that what our conversation tonight has done is whetted your appetite for reading the book yourself, tonight at noon, A Love Story. And the Aurora Forum Stanford Lively Arts Jazz Book Club will meet tomorrow night in the coffee house at 6:30 before the concert to talk about the book. And please come whether you've read it or not. We can read passages and talk about them together and talk about the things that we've learned here together this evening. So hope to see you then.
You can download it onto your Kindle and get it right now.
That's right. So thank you very much.
The Aurora Forum is presented by Stanford Lively Arts and the Stanford Institute for Creativity in the Arts, and is co-sponsored by the Office of the President and Provost and Stanford's Office of Public Affairs. The Aurora Forum is produced by Mark Gonnerman. If you have questions or comments about this or other Aurora Forum programs, contact auroraforum@stanford.edu.
For more, please visit us at stanford.edu.